Tomorrow is the 2018 Boston Marathon, so I thought I'd give you some history on my runs at the Boston Marathon. Way back in 1979, I actually ran my first Boston Marathon. Now, some background, I had a lot of issues with sciatica, lower back issues, which started early that year, and I struggled through much of the late fall and early spring with severe sciatic nerve pain and very little ability to train. I finally was able to train probably 30 to 40 miles a week going into Boston. I was already in the race, so it's one of those things I was going to do regardless. And I went to the race, stayed with my coach, Bill Squires, in Revere, Massachusetts, right along the beach. And I remember that particular Boston Marathon was cold and rainy. Toshihiko Seiko, the great Japanese runner who had beaten Bill Rogers at the Fukuoka Marathon, was under a yellow school bus for about 2 hours, shivering in the cold rain, waiting for the start. And then just before the start, we all hear this helicopter. And this helicopter comes in. This is probably 5 minutes before the start, lands right near the starting line, and out jumps Bill Rogers. So he didn't wait for 2 hours in the cold and rain. He actually was chauffeured to the start by a helicopter, which was kind of cool for him. He went on to win that day in 2:09:27, which was then the fastest time ever at the Boston Marathon. Bill Rogers had won in 75, 77, 78, and this was his fourth Boston win. I, on the other hand, went out like a maniac despite my lack of training and sciatic issues, which were still bothering me quite a bit, and went through 10 miles in around a little under 60 minutes actually. So I was hauling, but I was starting to struggle already, and slowed precipitously, I like that word, over the next 16 miles, and crawled home in 2 hours 58 minutes and some odd seconds. It was my slowest marathon to date, and I was glad to get my first Boston finish, but very disappointed in the time, of course, but couldn't do a whole lot about it. So 1980. Well, guess what happened in the spring of 80? Sciatic issues again. Sciatica is a very crippling type ailment. If you've ever had it before, it's excruciatingly painful. I was able to get maybe a little more mileage in than I had the previous year, and my friend David Dow was going to run, so we both were going to stay with Bill Squires in Revere Beach. And remember the night before the race, I made us a big package of Kraft macaroni and deluxe macaroni and cheese, and we shared that. That was our pre-race meal. And Bill Squires took us to the start and talked to us about strategy. He knew I'd been injured, and Dave had recently run a 2:27 at the Houston Marathon. Kid was only 19 years old. Dave, my friend, has over 170,000 lifetime running miles to this point. I'm well over 100,000, but he is quite a bit ahead of me and still runs every day. Well, anyway, that was one of the hotter Boston Marathons. Bill Rogers once again won the race in 1980, deciding not to even attempt the Olympic trials since the Olympic boycott had already been announced by President Jimmy Carter. So Bill figured, why not run Boston? And he won his Boston Marathon. I guess that would be his fifth Boston Marathon in 1980. And I struggled once again, crawling after a super fast first 10 to 15 miles, and had my personal worst marathon in 2 hours and 59 minutes. So that was a new personal worst for me. Fortunate even to finish that race and to be under 3 hours. I was a little bit pleased with that, but disappointed, of course, that I wasn't able to train properly. My friend David Dial had a phenomenal race. He was 2 hours, 24 minutes, 19 seconds, around 40th overall, maybe. Had a phenomenal day. Unfortunately for David, that was his best ever marathon. He had a series of injuries over the next several years, and he and I both trained prodigious amounts of mileage, well over 140, 150 miles a week, and Dave suffered a string of injuries that pretty much curtailed his racing career. He came back to run some decent 10Ks later, but as far as marathons, that was still his lifetime best. So, on to 1981, and this time I had it dialed, baby. I had just run the Houston Marathon a few months earlier in my personal best, finally breaking 2:30 with a 2:28:47 pace by the legendary Gary Bjorklund, who was using it as a hard training run. And I was ready. I had trained well over 100 miles per week. I was in my last year of college. I only had one semester and a little bit of a summer semester to go. So I was dialed in, and literally 2 weeks before the race, 2 weeks and 2 days before the race, I was out on a training run and across the street to make a right turn. I normally run facing traffic, as you should, and I was struck from behind by an SUV, and I didn't know what had hit me, but I just knew that I was flying through the air. I stumbled trying to get up the first time, fell down, tried to get up the second time, fell again, fell the third time after trying to get up, and just lay there for a while thinking, well, maybe I'm dead after all. And finally I was able to struggle to my feet. My shoulder and especially my hip was incredibly painful. I could barely walk, and I staggered up to this SUV that was parked on the side of the road, and this lady was crying. She had her head down on the steering wheel, and I knocked on her window and startled her. I think she thought she'd killed me, and she was really surprised to see me. And she, oh, I'm so sorry, sir. My kids were fighting in the back seat, and I turned around and didn't even see what I was doing, and I'm so sorry. Well, her towing mirror, the big mirrors that stick out on the side, is what struck me shoulder high and threw me forward about 30 or 40 feet. And I landed, unfortunately, on my hip and knew I was badly injured, but we exchanged information. She agreed to pay for any doctor bills, and I was not going to go to a regular doctor because I knew he would probably tell me, yeah, you're injured, you can't run the Boston Marathon. So I went to my kinesiologist, Dr. John Bandy, and he scheduled me for some x-rays, and turns out that I had a fractured hip. I had a pretty good crack in my pelvis, and he said, well, I guess that's that. I said, no, I'm running the Boston Marathon. So I somehow ran, and back to the day of the accident, I actually ran back to work. I was, during my lunch break, I was out for a training run, and so instead of going directly back to work, I finished my 5-mile training run somehow, went back, staggered in, and told my boss I'd been struck by a car. Of course, I was all bloody and scraped up, so he knew something had happened. And yeah, that was the story of my getting hit by a car. And well, I went to the Boston Marathon anyway, and lined up, and still felt fairly confident with all the training, and ran a respectably good race for running in pain the entire way, and finished in 2 hours and 31 minutes. And the neat thing about that race, I remember that I finished with Joan Benoit Samuelson. She was just Joan Benoit then, and we actually ran the last 3 miles or so together, and neither of us had our best race, but we finished in 2:31, and that was that. I was amazed that I could do that with a broken hip, but darn it, man, one of these days I'm going to get Boston right. So that was my history with Boston the first 3 years. The next several years I didn't run Boston for various reasons, and finally returned to the Boston Marathon in 1986. I was then working for Runner's World, had suffered a couple of bouts of the flu during the winter, so probably went out a little faster than I should, struggled home in 2:36 and change. That was 1986. 1987, similar situation. Went out a little bit too quickly, struggled home in 2:38. So yeah, it's getting worse, right? 2:31, 2:37, 2:36, 2:38. In 1988, I had run the Houston Marathon in January in 2 hours and 27 minutes on a really warm day, and got the flu again shortly thereafter, but this time I recovered properly, trained properly, and rested properly before the Boston Marathon. I remember I worked the expo leading up to the race, and the Runner's World staff had graciously given me time off the day before the race so I could relax. Ran a very smart race. I normally went out way too fast. This time I went out conservatively. The first half was just under 1:15. The second half was just under 1:14. I ran 2 hours, 28 minutes and some odd seconds, finished in the top 100 for the first time ever in the Boston Marathon. Actually, the 2:31 was just inside the top 100 as well. So the second time I'd finished in the top 100 in the Boston Marathon. Smartest race I've ever run. Wasn't even sore after the race. This was amazing, or not as sore as you would imagine running the Boston Marathon. If you've ever run that, you know what I mean. You tend to walk downstairs backwards for the next several days, but actually a very smart race, and passed people the entire second half since I negative split that particular race. So that was 1988. A long hiatus from the Boston Marathon, got into my teaching career. Didn't run again until 1997. I missed the Centennial Edition, 1996. So 1997, I ran the race and ran in a brand new pair of Nike shoes. That was so smart, Kim. Brand new pair of racing shoes. They were white with red and blue trim. Well, by mile 12, they were red with red and blue trim because I had developed a huge series of blisters on the bottom of my foot, and I was basically unable to even walk, much less run. So I staggered off at mile 15 and a half and took the subway back. On Boston Marathon Day, you're able to get the subway with your race number for free. So it was actually the red car, I believe, and then the green, connected to the green car back to the finish line. My first DNF at Boston, my second DNF overall. I had a situation at the Cleveland Marathon where I DNF with an illness, and Boston, I certainly didn't want a DNF. I was in really good shape and actually went through the half that day despite the blisters in 1 hour and 13 minutes, 1 hour 14 minutes, so a pretty fast time. But my race was curtailed at mile 15 and a half. So that's my history of the Boston Marathon. I went on to coach several runners who qualified for and ran in the Boston Marathon, and I have a few of my former athletes running tomorrow, so best wishes. I hope you guys have phenomenal races. The weather doesn't look like it's going to be ideal, but deal with it. Everyone's running with the same or in the same weather. And yeah, I'll be watching the Boston Marathon live on NBC Sports Network tomorrow. Cheers.